Founder of South Jersey Forward, a nonprofit and nonpartisan think tank and advocacy organization. Really appreciate everybody jumping on with us tonight to talk about the sad state of local media here in Southern New Jersey and how to fix it. And I'm very honored and elated to have people a lot smarter than me on this topic to talk. First, I want to introduce Scott Cronick, the host of Off the Press with Scott Cronick on 1400 WOD AM here in the greater Atlantic City area. Scott also spent 29 years, a lifer at the Press of Atlantic City, so knows in and out of newsrooms, knows his way around things, and a great resource. Thank you, Scott, for being here. I want to introduce next Mike Shapiro, who's the founder and editor and publisher, CEO, all that of TAPinto. And I didn't know this, Mike. In 2008, you started your all-online local news source in your hometown of New Providence. So started with that, eventually stopped being a practicing attorney and focused full-time on media. So, Mike, thank you for being here. My old friend Liz Meyers, who's the publisher and editor of TAPinto in Bordentown, Mount Laurel, and Hamilton, Robbinsville, also the head of her own public relations firm. Thank you, Liz. An old friend of mine back from the legislative days, so appreciate you being on. And finally, last but not least, I apologize having some video technical difficulties. David Wildstein, the founder and editor of New Jersey Globe, and founded the first New Jersey political news site back in 2000, politicsnj.com, Politicker NJ it became, and now the New Jersey Globe. So a lot of us who little puppies in New Jersey politics, like Liz and I, read our fix of Politics and Politicker back in the day, and now reading New Jersey Globe. So appreciate everybody joining us. Please, we want to be interactive. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, thoughts, please put them in the chat. If you're watching on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter, we'd love to answer some of those questions. So obviously, we know why we're here, the state of local media, which is not good in Southern New Jersey. We were just talking before we went live, the Press of Atlantic City has gone to 3 days a week print, and they're mailing it to you, slashing newsrooms. Gannett took an axe to the Vineland Daily Journal and the Courier Post newsrooms. We used to have coverage of every local council meeting and mayoral press conference. That's gone by the wayside. And it's not indicative. It's indicative of the country as a whole, not just Southern New Jersey. But clearly, we are in a news desert here, and we've got people a lot smarter than me figuring out ways how to fix that, and I look forward to having a vibrant conversation. So I'll start off with Liz Meyers, since she was the first to jump on, and I'll go around the room with this question. What happened? How did we get to this position of a news desert in Southern New Jersey?
Well, I think it was sort of a slow walk. I came from a family where you watched the nightly news, and there was no talking through it. And then as I got older, I was a full Sunday hard paper, and then there was the migration towards, there's some news online, but you're still only getting everything in that hard copy. And if you remember the days, was it when the first Videos MTV video killed the radio star? I think social media kind of killed local news. People started putting their press releases up on their Facebook pages or just tweeting out, there were, and there still are reporters who will sit at press conferences and tweet lines, and then they take those lines and that's a story. But now you see even that landscape changing a little bit. So, I think it's just a bit of an evolution of technology brought us here, but what we're losing is a core part of our daily news that we need. And that's what's going on in our town, in our county. So many people get their news from cable news or podcasts or different things like that. But I always believe that the things that are local news impact you a lot more than perhaps what's going on in Congress, right? What's going on in a school board tonight is going to directly impact your kids in your classroom in September. So we're losing that, and we're trying to find a way back there. I mean, through our TAPinto sites and through local radio, we have to get back there because we're losing that connection to our community that you're not going to pick up on social media. You're not going to pick up on TikTok or, that's entertainment. That's not news. And we need folks to realize there's a big difference.
And to your point, Liz, I'll kick it off to Mike Shapiro. You've been an OG at this, starting your own news site in 2008, and then seeing the trend, and then moving to the TAPinto platform. I mean, how did we get here? And did you see the warning signs back in 2008 that, hey, we're going to have a problem in a few years with local journalism?
Yeah, it was interesting because it's not just a problem in southern New Jersey; it's a problem throughout the country. There's 10,000 towns in the country that currently have no local newspaper, no local news site. And back in 2008, when I started what was called the Alternative Press at the time, and for those who were wondering, that's how we got the TAP for TAPinto, was from the Alternative Press, our original name. But when I started it back then, we had a weekly hard copy newspaper in my town, and that's what we had. And the concern that was brought to my attention, and one of the reasons why I started TAPinto, was that you would have to wait like a week, sometimes 2 weeks, to find out what was going on in the town. So if the football team won a game, you'd have to wait a week and a half. Or if there was a rash of car burglaries, like actually happened back then, you wouldn't even know about it for a week and a half. And so, but when I would go to cover a council meeting, they were there and I was there covering that local council meeting. And unfortunately, today, in almost all the towns where there's a TAPinto site, we're the only ones that are there covering the town council, the board of ed, planning, zoning board, et cetera. And it's so important for our democracy because, without that kind of coverage, people don't know what's going on in their town. They vote based on, grayed out big glossy postcards that they get in the mail with no factual basis for their voting. And it also is a problem in terms of our elected officials because there's no one to hold them accountable. And so I did see it back then, and it's only accelerated since then. This real need for local news. And what's interesting is that it's not a matter that people don't want local news. People want to get local news, and we see that not only in our numbers but just in everyday life. The issue is what's gone on in terms of the news industry, where they've just over the last basically 15 years really gutted these newsrooms. Multinational conglomerates have bought up these publications, slashed the newsrooms, closed publications, and the end result is a real lack of local news in so many towns, not only in New Jersey but throughout the country.
David Wildstein, New Jersey Globe, that's a good segue. You've talked a lot in your history about based on the corporations and other folks slashing newsrooms and slashing the media. And, I'm always tickled by some of your tweets where, some outlets, instead of covering they're either covering news that was a month or two old, or they're covering more stuff for Clickbait and, the newest pizza place around the corner, which is all good. And I get it. There's a part of that for news. But, how do we get to a point where that's driving clicks and not, a council meeting, a freeholder meeting, and things like that?
Yeah, I think part of it is some people accepting responsibility for what's gone wrong. And I think daily newspapers that are especially troubling right now, it's not like they didn't see it coming. Elizabeth said it was a slow roll, but they missed it. They didn't want to admit that there was a problem. I remember a columnist for a Gannett paper writing in around 2003 that the internet was a fad and people will always get their news from newspapers. And he was wrong. He was really wrong. And I say that as somebody, I've become a critic of some of these newspapers, but it's not like I'm not a fan. I mean, I started out in the early 70s. I was a paper boy. I was a sports correspondent for the Star Ledger when a game would be finished at 6 o'clock at night, and 12 hours later, coverage of a high school sports game was in the newspaper at your front door. And that was really important to people. It was not just getting the news, but getting it fast and trusting people. And I mean, it ages me, but when I was a councilman and mayor back in the the early and mid 80s, I mean, I had 2 daily newspapers and a weekly newspaper sitting at every meeting, watching everything we're doing. And the bottom line is, elected officials behave differently when somebody's watching them, when somebody's in the room, eyeballing them, taking notes, holding them accountable for what they're doing. And I really worry that that's going away. We're seeing news deserts all over New Jersey, most specifically in areas that are economically disadvantaged. I use Camden as an example, and TAPinto has a great site there, but the Courier Post is just, they've gone away on everything but collecting a handout. They still get these legal ads that subsidize them, but they don't do anything in return. And you know, the Camden's a great example because it costs $1,040 a year to go to a newsstand and buy a newspaper every day. And there's a lot of people in that city that can't afford to spend over $1,000 a year to buy a paper. And guess what? Those newspapers are carrying legal ads that are an attempt at transparency to sort of explain what's going on, and here are the ordinances that are being produced. And the same people whose tax dollars are being used to pay for those ads, they can't afford to buy the paper. So I think there's a miscommunication by this old media as to what's going wrong. Sometimes I wonder if they still get the fact that they're not as relevant as they used to be.
Well, and that's a good segue to Scott Cronick, who you spent 29 years at the Press of Atlantic City. Obviously, you know local journalism, and you cut your teeth as a local journalist, and especially in an area like Atlantic City, which had a big boom of casinos, a lot of local coverage, not just of local council meetings and keeping elected officials accountable, as David said, but the casino industry, looking at the ebbs and flows of economic development. But you even brought something up to me interesting earlier when we were on your show about kind of the wall that you saw between the editorial side and the advertising side. I'd love for you to talk about it after you talk about some general comments, because I think that maybe is contributing to this idea of we're not keeping folks accountable because those lines are being blurred.
So thank you, Michael, for having me, number one. But yeah, I think all of the above, what Michael and Elizabeth and David all said are all true. But, I lived and breathed it. I was part of the giant corporate head, and whether we were locally owned at first by a great company called Abarta, which they had one newspaper and they treated it like a family newspaper. And then once they sold, that's when we saw the wheels come off. And they didn't have that interest in delivering the news. The people that bought us didn't have the interest in delivering the news like we had before. They also didn't have the loyalty to the people that worked for them, which was a huge part of it. Most of the people that were at the press when I was there were there for 20, 30 years like I was, right? And that loyalty went away. And there's a lot of reasons for that. When I started working for the press, it was actually for the weeklies that they owned called the Currents, which eventually they got rid of. But I remember, I think part of it is work ethic. And when I started working for the press in 1994, I wrote for the Current, I'm not exaggerating, 20 to 30 stories a week, where I would cover every single aspect of one town, Egg Harbor Township. And I went to every meeting, everything that I could get my hands on. And then I covered sports. I did all of it, right? And that was kind of the job. And I made $18,000 a year, right? And I didn't mind it at all. I loved it, right? And I think that the new generation doesn't, I don't want to generalize, but I don't see that passion, in journalism or really in anything, to work 80 hours a week for $18,000. Like, my son's 25. He would tell me I was insane, right, to do anything like that. But it was a passion. It was something I wanted to do, not because I was getting paid to do it, right? I remember writing my first stories for a local newspaper when I was 16, reviewing movies, and I did it for free and was happy to do it for free, right? So I feel like that kind of went away. And I think that as we went on and that work ethic went away, that meant that content wasn't as available and there wasn't as much content for people. And then when the internet came out, there was fear by the corporate people that owned it to cut back on giving stories for free, right? So they were like, we had all this content, and we did, man. We had tons of content. We had 100 newspaper reporters working for the Press of Atlantic City in the peak time of, say, 94 to 2008 or something like that. I mean, that's a lot of people reporting on one area, right? So then they started giving it out for free, and they were scared to start charging. And that is the biggest problem, not just with the Press of Atlantic City, but all newspapers. They just were scared, right? The only people that really started doing it right eventually were the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Even today, newspapers still struggle. What should be free? To me, nothing should be free. Why are they giving anything free out to the media? So I think that became a real problem. And then as content got cut back and the work ethic wasn't there to produce the content, and then people like Warren Buffett bought our newspaper, and then we were eventually sold to Lee Enterprises. That became a real problem. And then you're worried about, wow, is this other giant hedge fund going to buy you? And I said, who cares if they buy it? It couldn't be any worse than Lee Enterprises, right? It couldn't be any worse than Warren Buffett owned us. Like, it was already at the bottom of the barrel. So I just didn't understand the fear of all the people that were around me, because I was a director of the paper. I was one of the 5 directors of the newspaper, and I would push them to do things. And there was just this fear of their own shadow, the fear of like stopping content for free, fear of just doing things that just made sense to anybody who was a business person, but they wanted to live on what was legacy, and legacy only takes you so far. So I think there was the resistance. And then, of course, they didn't want to pay journalists, and then they cut back on how many people. Probably with that right now, the Press of Atlantic City has about 15 full-time journalists, which is, so how do you cover an area with 15 full-time journalists? So then now they're 3 days a week. So now you cut back content. Now you cut back days. Now you cut back all that stuff. Why do you think people are going to subscribe to your product if you just keep taking things away? And not only were they taking things away, they were charging more for it. I remember saying, like, wow, we are now, maybe our paper used to be 60, 80 pages on a Sunday. We were down to like 20 or 30 pages on a Sunday and charging triple the amount for that newspaper. Like, none of it made sense, right? So on top of all that, when Trump took office, he made us the enemy of the people. And, I don't know. I mean, he made a media people like we're the devil. Like, we're trying to report. And I used to tell people, they used to call us the liberal whatever newspaper. And I used to tell them, listen, I'm a director at this company. And I can tell you that in all the conversations that I've had, in every meeting that I've been in, from corporate to the bottom, I've never heard anybody saying, don't run that story because it's too liberal or too conservative, or make sure that you put a liberal or a conservative slant on that story. That is just like, to me, fairy tale stuff. It might happen on higher levels with newspapers that really try to take certain stances, but for the average middle America, normal newspaper under 50,000 circulation, none of that happens. We're too busy to be making conversations on a story by story basis. So I just feel like all of those things combined spelled out the doom of daily newspapers. Now, how we get back there, I guess, will be our next questions.
Well, I think one of the things that's important, and I'm curious to hear Mike and Liz and David's thoughts on this, because in one respect, we've got to fill the news desert, but at the same time, we have to make sure journalism, particularly in Southern New Jersey, is profitable not only for proprietors, but also journalists can pay the mortgage and pay the rent and put the kids in school and all that sort of stuff. And we've seen a brain drain. I know, like the woman, I think Diane D'Amica, right? She was at that's her name, or she's at Stockton now. Did education reporting. Another one left, and all that sort of stuff. And even folks from NJPBS have gone to work in state government, just because it's you can pay the bills more versus journalism. So, but I am curious, Mike and Liz and David, and any or all you can jump in. Your services are free for the reader, and candidly, how do you make that a sustainable business model where to Scott's point, we should. In one respect, you charge for stuff. New York Times charges for their paper, for their online access. Your publications, the New Jersey Globe and the TAPinto networks, are free for readers. So how does that a sustainable model going forward? That's for anybody who wants to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just start it off. I mean, our model kind of addresses the various issues that a lot of people have brought up. TAPinto sites are locally owned and operated. So while we're a company, we're franchised. So I started the company, and then about 10 years ago, we started franchising. So each TAPinto publication is independently owned and operated. Yet we have rules in place regarding quality. So like each site has to do at least one original local news story a day. They have to be objective. They have to follow the Society of Professional Journalists ethics. But by doing it this way, it's journalism from the ground up, not from the top down. And by doing it this way, also, we can significantly reduce costs for everybody involved, which enables our model to be profitable for our franchisees, also where there's no paywall. And we believe strongly, and this is the one point I disagree with Scott on, was, we believe really strongly that people, regardless of their socioeconomic background, should be able to know what's going on in their town. They shouldn't have to choose between, paying for medicine and paying for their local news subscription. So our model is 100% advertising based, but we've also modeled the advertising so that the advertising is not linked to the news content. So basically, all of our sites are doing their own original local news reporting every day. And they're also getting local and regional and statewide businesses to market on the TAPinto sites. But by doing it that way, the news is not compromised, which to us is really important. Yet the model works. And at this point in New Jersey, we have 89 TAPinto sites covering about 125 municipalities, which we're really proud about. But and TAPinto is one of the models out there that I think is a possible solution to the local news crisis. There are other models out there as well. But I think what's nice about it is it gives people hope that there is a way to kind of help to restore local news in communities throughout the country and obviously throughout New Jersey. But thanks for the question.
Let me answer that sort of as a franchise owner, right? Look, when I came into this, before I started my first site with a colleague, I was in a career change, and it was sort of hope that there would be a new lane that fit my, my family, my lifestyle. And yeah, it is a business, but at the same time, you do prioritize the news, right? And Mike is honest, and we are very, very, very forward upfront with folks. If something is sponsored content, it says so. So folks know if you're reading a story on our sites, if it's our news or if it is somebody who is paid for that. I don't know that that is the case with some of the print models. I don't have I don't have any idea if, perhaps the advertising drives what they cover. I don't know. I've not been in those newsrooms. I come from the communication side to the journalism. But I can tell you, I think I wrote 5 stories today. Only one of them was for a sponsored content, and it was about a concert in the park for an advertiser, and it is marked, and that is how folks know about it. But 4 other stories were true local news down the lane. And so you do, as an owner, it is part of a business that we take on to get that local community support. And it kind of goes hand in glove, right? As far as businesses want to have connection with our audience because they don't have an alternative, right? If you look at some of the monthlies that still exist in hard copy, to price out an ad there that folks only see once a month versus if you were to look at a TAPinto model, you're definitely getting more value and more eyeballs, and you're getting timeliness and you're getting a direct connection, which I think is the benefit of digital news now is, you can kind of click on ads or stories and get right to folks. One thing I did want to say is, David, you'd mentioned that the $1,000 a year for somebody in Camden. That is crazy, that number. Yeah, you're right. Somebody in Camden does not have just $1,000 to buy a newspaper. So are we saying that because you're in a different economic thing, you don't have the right or ability to get your news quickly? You're looking at alternative models. And then you mentioned about these legal ads, that they're posting the legal ads for meetings, but they're not covering them. So do we say to these print papers, well, if you take the local money, you need to be covering that? Right now they're benefiting and they're able to keep somewhat afloat versus others like, TAPinto and what have you, who are not part of that system because of the way the law is. And we are working as business owners. So it's an interesting, ebb and flow and where you fall out on. It's news, but it's still your job and it's still your business. And where do we go from there? $1,000 a year. That just kind of struck me as a crazy number.
I agree with you. And I think we're mostly on the same page. People need to remember that media organizations, like ours, like all the daily newspapers in New Jersey, there used to be 17 of them. Those of you who may remember the Gloucester County Times or the Salem Sunbeam, or some really good local newspapers that were hyper local. And I think one of the things we should remember is these are businesses, whether it's Advanced Publications, the Star Ledger, or the Gannett chain, or the new owners, whoever owns the Press of Atlantic City this week. They're all in it to make money. They're not volunteers, but and you can't deny them what they need to keep the lights on.
Mhm.
But what you can say is that at a time where you're trying to do more with less, where you're, reporting staffs at these newspapers are probably about 25% of where they were 15 years ago. Their paid circulation, the number of newspapers that are actually published, is down 81% on the average in the last 6 years. You've almost got to be mature in how you handle it. And you have to say, I can't do as much as I used to. So we're going to pick a lane and we're going to do a couple things really well. The example I use is I would love to cover New Jersey politics and the New York Yankees. Can I say Yankees on a South Jersey thing, Michael? I don't know. I apologize.
Why not? All Phillies people.
But
I'm a Yankee fan.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to cover the Yankees. I'd love to pivot from the New Jersey legislature to the Yankees at night, but I can't do both of those well. So you have to pick and choose. And what happens is you've got newspapers that they're losing, not just readers, but institutional knowledge. And people that really know what's going on, they are disappearing. And you're getting reporters that don't have ties to the local community, and they will helicopter in when they sense there's a story that they can get some clicks on, but then they go away, and a lot of times they don't get it right. And one of the things I hear over and over from comms people in government and politics is the frequency by which they get a call from somebody saying, "Hey, I'm new here. I just started this beat. Can you walk me through what's going on and explain it to me?" And by the time they're finished explaining it, that person has moved on, and there's no continuity in the coverage at all. So if what it takes for a place like the Star Ledger to stay in business is to report on what the best deals on Amazon are for a new vacuum cleaner, they're a for-profit business. It's their right to do it, but don't claim that that's local news, because in my opinion, that's not even close to local news. And I like a good hamburger or slice of pizza as well as anybody, but they're making decisions that's a priority. And and I'll leave you with this too, is the Star Ledger had probably one of the best reporters out there, Jonathan Salant, as their running their Washington bureau. He was the only Jersey reporter on Capitol Hill, covering 2 U.S. senators and 12 members of Congress and federal agencies that are impacting New Jersey every day. And the Ledger decided, let's get rid of him. Let's cut him to save money, but let's keep the reporter that is checking out where to get a good vacuum cleaner. And they're right, but I don't understand it and I don't agree with it.
No, you're right. I work for NJ.com, and I hope this. I do some freelance for them, and I hope this doesn't cost me my freelance job. But it's all about clickbait. I mean, it's all about what is going to get the most clicks. So I'll give you for an example. The hot topic right now is Gregory in Summers Point is being battled for his trademark for Taco Tuesday. And he's a friend of mine, and they know that I'm friends with Gregory, so they hired me to do the story. And the story did so well and got so many clicks, they begged me for, not begged me, but they kept saying, is there an update? Is there an update? Is there an update on that story? Because they knew that if we wrote another one, it was going to get just as many hits as the previous one did. Now, in between then, I probably pitched them 10 great stories that they said no to, right? But because they know that the one story is going to be click, 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 that's the one that they are hiring me to write. And it is an interesting, fun story, and it should be written. But that said, it's not about deep journalism. It's about what's going to get the clicks these days.
What's interesting?
But does that? Oh, go ahead.
If I could just interject on one thing is, so please. I have 3 different TAP sites, and we cover 4, 6, 7 towns throughout the 3. What hits in Hamilton, Robbinsville, doesn't hit in Bordentown, doesn't hit in Mount. I what I find super fascinating is the like social studies of this, and maybe the I don't know. I love to watch to see what makes somebody in Mount Laurel click versus Bordentown. Same county. You would think if I wrote the same county story, right, that you'd get the same reaction because it's a county story. No, it's very interesting. And it's one of the things I find just fascinating about what I do is to be like, what are you going to read? You know, and we've been able to figure it out. Mount Laurel, they love their education. Universally, folks love to know that that kid in any town got a merit scholarship. We don't get into sports, you know. I mean, David, I wouldn't cover the Yankees at night because I don't even have a clue. But so we don't cover sports in that way. But there are some TAPinto sites that do a fantastic job of local sports, and that is their bread and butter. And I hope that my sites can get there someday. You know, so it's always sort of keeping yourself motivated, but also, if you're being honest, writing what you know the community is. I live in one of my towns, and so I know what clicks in my town, right? And yes, do I do the clickbait stories? I am known to write a zoning board story about some new food place, a Habit Burger, a Chipotle, a Starbucks. I have a joke with a councilman, what gets more clicks, a Wawa or a Starbucks? P.S. It's Wawa. And a lottery ticket. People will read a lottery ticket story like it's, especially with all this Powerball crazy. Did they buy a ticket? No. But they love those stories. And those are easy stories, so it kind of buys me some time while I go and spend 7 hours on a school budget referendum that only 800 people read. But that's really what I'm here to do, right? Is get into that, you know, we're going to cut kindergarten story, but people are still going to go read that. You know, you can't force people to read things. So you do have to give them a little bit, but neither story is making me money. Unlike, like you said, some folks do monetize the top 10 places to buy a veggie burger in New Jersey. So it's.
But doesn't that kind of, I think your point and David's point, doesn't that sum up one of the issues where, yes, in some respects, the TAPinto model is profitable. It's a franchisee model. New Jersey Globe has its readership. It's profitable with advertising. But isn't the fact that if we're related to this clickbait, and I'm frustrated, frankly, with our local paper that, you know, and I love the press of Atlantic City, and I'm probably getting in trouble for saying this, but the point of South Jersey Forward is to piss people off and get things done. You know, I see these breaking news emails, quote unquote, from the press of Atlantic City. Micro wrestling at the Ducktown Tavern is not breaking news. So I understand that they have to send these emails. And I've had this conversation with Buzz Kehoe directly. Some of the things that are considered breaking news are not breaking news. I get it. They have open rates in your emails. You can give that to advertisers. But isn't that the problem, that we have a position now where things are done just for the sake of getting clicks and eyeballs? And I'll throw this out there to the group. Does this precipitate the need to have more publicly funded news organizations? Do we expand an NJPBS where instead of just having an office in Newark, there's frankly state funds to create one in Camden or Atlantic City or Vineland? Do you have some sort of publicly funded newspaper or news organization? Now, I get it. People are going to say, well, Suleiman, you're a big government guy. You want to spend more taxpayer dollars, this, that, and the other. But if there's a void and the private sector is not filling that void, doesn't it lead itself to more public investment into the news?
I think, and I lived through legislative days when we got rid of NJN and privatized that. How are you going to guarantee people are going to get there? People are cutting the cord, right? So you have that challenge.
I don't think government subsidy is the way to go for a lot of reasons. One is because you're going to be accused of being a communist regime if you have your government paying for newspapers, right? Kind of that's what they do in China or Russia, right? So we don't want that, right? But when Warren Buffett bought the Press of Atlantic City, I was like, wow, this is awesome. The guy's worth $116 billion, right? His parents met at a newspaper. Warren Buffett would not exist if it wasn't for newspapers. So he bought these newspapers because he had this passion for newspapers, right? Wrong. He couldn't wait to bolt on newspapers quicker than anybody I've ever seen. And what would have hurt him to take $1 billion or $2 billion and make a trust fund for newspapers, at least the ones he owned, to exist? $1 billion could have let his newspapers last probably for 100 years. You know, they wouldn't have lost that kind of money. But I do think that the Philadelphia Inquirer, even though it's not as good as it used to be, has it right with nonprofit organizations kind of running it, maybe public funding, but not state funding, but trying to raise money maybe that way through entrepreneurs, through people who are good donors, through people who are people who care about news, like I thought Warren Buffett did. But I think getting the government involved is a bad idea.
Yeah, I agree completely.
The only thing I would
No, I'm just I'll be quick, but I agree completely. And for those of us, Liz has been there. I've been there where we've seen how the sausage is made during a government doing a budget. The last thing you want are a bunch of politicians determining which news outlet is going to receive money, because that can only end badly for the people that need the news.
Yeah, and I think part of it, I agree with what everybody said. I think part of it too is the advertising model. So, like, for example, with us at TAPinto, we don't charge based on clicks or anything like that. It's, there's a flat monthly fee that advertisers pay depending on the size of the ad and how many TAPinto sites they want to advertise in, et cetera. But the reason I created that kind of model is because it de-incentivizes our franchisees from doing clickbait. Obviously franchisees kind of want to compete with each other to get the most traffic and stuff like that. But it's not out of an advertising bent. Some of our sites that have low traffic have some of our highest advertising revenue because the advertising is not tied to traffic, which I think is important. But the problem is that most media companies today, they don't sell their advertising based on that, like the way we do. They sell it based on clicks. They sell it based on impressions, et cetera. But a lot of those publications also have subscriptions and things like that. So they have a lot of different things in the mix. But we purposely here did not create our revenue model based on that, so that we would not have any kind of incentive to sensationalize the news or to create that kind of clickbait, which is kind of interesting.
I would say to everybody's point, this is why I'm go ahead, Scott.
I was just going to say, speaking of advertising, getting back to the question Michael initially asked me, but I went so long-winded I forgot to answer it, was that there was a blur between advertising and the newsroom eventually. And when I first got there, we had two separate buildings. We were so big that we needed two giant buildings to house editorial on one side and advertising on the other. And eventually that just got smaller and smaller and smaller to the point that now both buildings are gone and they rent an office that might fit 20 or 30 people. That's how bad it's gotten. But the point I'm making is that I think people don't trust the media, one, because of what I said earlier, but B, because that blur did happen. I remember, before in a meeting, never would an advertising rep or an advertising manager make a comment of like, hey, do you really have to write that story about Borgata? Borgata's a good advertiser. Like, my editor would have flown out of his seat and thrown the advertiser rep through the window if they said that. But as time went on, you saw them say those things and the editor not get mad and all of a sudden would question whether a story should be written or not. And I think that doesn't help in the, cumulative trust of the media, right? And it's with validation. I was part of it. I saw it. And I'm not saying that they went out of their way to do things to write positively about advertisers. I just think that they would sometimes try to avoid negativity, if that makes sense.
Well, to your point, I think everybody's point is we've got to change the advertising model. And we have a comment in the chat from Deborah about there's an appetite for state habit coverage. I will double down on a thought of at least some sort of public investment where, to Liz's point, I don't know why anybody messed with NJN. Didn't have the best graphics, best cameras, but it provided great coverage. Even when I was a kid, it was great coverage. Did the change to NJTV, now NJPBS, did that have a net benefit? I don't know. I mean, clearly the state used to invest in NJN, obviously back in the day, sponsoring it. The clips are all on the Eagleton YouTube site, the debates and everything they did, and you don't see as much. And no disrespect to NJPBS, I watch NJ Spotlight News. I don't watch it on TV. I watch it on YouTube and always keep up on it. But could there be a way for an incubator to have some, or maybe just nonprofit crowdsourcing, right? I mean, Scott and I talked about it earlier. This idea of breaking AC is the preeminent crime news coverage for our area, the TAPinto. I mean, is it so fragmented in this kind of gig economy, fragmented, digitized world we're in, where instead of getting your news at one source, it's if you want your political news, you go to the Globe. If you want your Bordentown news, you go to the TAPinto. If you want your entertainment news, you listen to Scott Cronick. Or are we at a point where just things are so fragmented that you're just going to take an agglomeration of news sources to fill people in? And is that a good or bad thing?
I think
that might just be.
I'm sorry,
go ahead.
sorry, Elizabeth. Go ahead.
I think people have a little bit of news ADD, and it might just be your phone. You can go boom 5 minutes here, boom 5 minutes there. Listen, I'll tell you the truth. My Instagram, if you look at it, it's a lot of news that I'll catch a headline and I'll read if that's something. So yeah, maybe I can in my stream be like, oh, I want to read this or this. So I don't know that we're going to ever get to that point where you're getting, and maybe it's better that way, right? We're not getting all of our news in one location because maybe it's, we have to, I think, educate some folks, younger folks really, about information literacy, how to be able to look at a news story and know that it's news and not a one-sided blog. What's the difference between a social media post and a news post, right? So it might be, I think, a good thing for people to be able to pop around and get your news, because then maybe we can start getting people's gears going and saying that doesn't sound right. Let me go check it against this source. Let me go check it against this.
Right.
Maybe that's good.
So Elizabeth, I agree and disagree at the same time.
Okay.
I think that we need a central place, A, because I'm lazy and I don't have to go look at 100 places to get, my news for the day. And B is I think we need somebody to stamp it in the sense this has been approved. This is good journalism by X people. So maybe it's a hub where, all of these sites and different people come together and work kind of independently while working together, if that makes sense. But you go to this core place and it's been accepted at this core place because it's good journalism. And that you can go to X site and you'll find your stuff and and all the people who are on here, as well as people that we trust, like Breaking AC News, who I think does a good job, like Michael said. And they've been vetted, right? Because there's so many people and so many different things out there. Who do you trust? Who do you know? Why do you think, you know what I mean? Who is bought by an advertiser? Who is a journalist? Who is somebody that you can trust? And maybe there's just a central place that you can go for your local news, but it goes through some sort of middle ground, some sort of place, some sort of hub where it's been vetted and you can say this has been approved and we know that they do good journalism and it's not comprised in any way.
Do you think people have to come to that though from an open-minded standpoint? I mean, look, when we were early on, I remember I was shocked. I got an email. Somebody called me fake news. And I was like, what? Fake news? Because there's people I think are coming to news from a negative. They're lying to me. You're full of it. Aging myself, Peter Jennings, he never lied to me. What? Yeah. Nighttime news, and then you hear stories later on of different other people that swore they were right. So I think we have to convince people at least come to the news from a neutral place before we can ever get to necessarily that place where people are going to buy everything in this one location is accurate and fair.
And one of the things that frightens me is that there's a generation or two generations of people out there that don't know what good news is because they haven't seen it. And I'm looking at Deb Howlett's question, and for those who you don't know, she was a State House reporter for the Star Ledger when the Star Ledger was great. She was a really good State House reporter, and she asked if there's an appetite for State House coverage. I'll take you back. I mean, I was a political nerd at a very young age, and I remember a time where the Star Ledger, on the day after a legislative session, would do a 4-page spread about what happened in Trenton, and you're not seeing any kind that type of delving into specific issues and explaining complicated issues without including an opinion in there that you're getting a lot today. And something else that concerns me is even when you can look and see that the legislature passed a bill that does A, B, and C, you don't really know how your legislator voted. And there's not a lot of reporting on explaining to people, well, here's an issue and here's what the legislature did, and maybe you agree or maybe you disagree, and you should be able to figure that out based on the quality of reporting because it has been given to you evenly and independently, but you still don't know how the people who represent you are voting. And now what that's done, and this ought to frighten everybody, is it means the only time people know whether their legislator is good or bad, or they like what their governor's doing, or their local officials, is when they have to spend money in a campaign every fall to tell people how they're doing. And there you're seeing people that are unknown. At the local level, people still know their mayor, they still know their council member. In towns where there's good, like where in the 100 and something towns where TAPinto reaches, you're building name identification for the mayor and for the council person. But one of the things I'm seeing, and Michael, I'm not going to ask you to reveal any of your polling data here, but I think you'll know what I mean. We're seeing more and more that legislators and state senators and assembly members and county commissioners and members of Congress are struggling to have their name known. Not only do people not know what they're doing, but people don't even know who represents them. So now what you're getting is this national influence of generic ballots. People are coming in more and more, and they're saying, well, I'm not happy with the Republicans, I'm voting Democratic, or the other way around. And you're not even getting independent identities from the people that are serving in office. And that ought to really bother people, because you can't hold somebody accountable if you don't know who they are.
Yeah.
Dave,
Mike Shapiro, you want to jump in there? I just want to bring Mike in. I know he's.
It's
like the good attorney, and usually quiet, So you legal eagles.
It's a great conversation. So but yeah, no, I mean, I agree 110% with what David just said. I mean, people and I think in towns where there is no local newspaper or no local news site, you see the same thing happening, where people are just basically voting based on whether they're a D or an R. They don't even know their name. They don't know what they stand for or anything like that.
Or worse, they were friends with somebody I know in town, so they must be okay.
Right.
Or I saw you post in the local Facebook group.
Mm-hmm. And that's the other thing is that in pretty much every town now, there's a town Facebook group where there's all kinds of rumors and misinformation being spread. And if there's no local newspaper or no local news site, there's nobody to rebut it. This actually happened just literally over the weekend. Thankfully, there is a local news site in the town. It's one of the it's in Woodbridge, but there was a rumor circulating that the superintendent had resigned. It was all over the place, and it wasn't true. And so, but I contacted TAPinto Woodbridge. I let them know about the rumor. They investigated it, and we had a big story out where it's like literally the superintendent and everybody else saying, no, there's no truth to this rumor. I'm here, and etc. But if there was no local news site to say that, what everybody in town thought that the superintendent was leaving and had to But this is the kind of stuff that's happening in communities, throughout New Jersey and throughout the country, where there's no local newspaper or no local news site to keep these rumors and this misinformation in check and let the people know what's really going on.
Yeah, and to what David said earlier, I agreed. Like, do people know what good journalism is? I'll give you an example. I was just on a cruise in Italy, and right outside of my room, there was a ballroom, and inside there was a convention for media watchdogs. And I was like, the first thing I said to my wife is like, that's the Fox News crowd in there 100%, right? So we're sitting at lunch one day, and there's these two older people that are sitting next to me, and I saw they had their little lanyards around their neck, and I played dumb. I didn't tell them that I was a journalist. I didn't, I was just the innocent cruise, naive shipmate next to them. And I was like, oh, so what's this media watchdog about? and they're like, oh, well, we're trying to keep an eye on the media to make sure that they're reporting things fair and journalistically. And I was like, oh, that's really great. And I was like, well, who is reporting things fair and ethically? And they were like, well, I can tell you who's not. And I was like, well, who's that? Well, CNN and CNBC and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. And I was like, oh, okay. And who is doing it right? Well, I watch Fox a lot, and I got to tell you that I think they keep it pretty down the middle. And I bit my tongue and I said, "You're absolutely right, sir." But again, that goes to what David said. Do people know, and do they want to know? And
sometimes you have to. Sometimes you just have to. I don't know if it's right to say it. Just force feed people and help them get on the right track. And I pulled up the Courier Post. And I'll say this quickly. Their top stories right now are racing pigs bring home the bacon at Burlington County Farm Fair, and Spot Barbie's truck tour in Cherry Hill this October, and 2 popular chicken places rising in Cherry Hill. And there's no mention of Congress. There's no mention of the legislature. There's no mention of the governor. There's no mention of elections coming up and what candidates are saying. So even those who might be well-intentioned and want to know more, if this is the type of news site that they're depending on, how are they to ever find out what's going on? Yeah. Unless you really, really want to know about the Barbie truck coming to Cherry Hill, but I don't know. I don't know if that's news. I don't know if that's news or whether that's just content.
The sad state of our society sometimes is people might care more about that Barbie truck than they care about who's running for mayor, because they're over it. They're over the negativity that they see on sort of the talking head paid to fight on TV or online or whatever, so some people do. And I've heard it from a lot of people. I just need to zone out, especially during COVID. I just can't listen anymore. I can't do it anymore. I was very pleasantly surprised recently to hear from my a girlfriend's daughter who's in 7th grade that the middle school in one of our towns we cover has a journalism class. 7th grade journalism. What? And they talk about coverage, and they brought up TAPinto as a local news site that's fair and balanced. And she said to me, she's like, by the way, my friend was in class, and she was so excited because, she knows me. And I was like, nah, really? Like, it was kind of crazy to me to be on the radar of a teacher who's probably just trying to survive 7th graders, right? To show to them. And maybe we need more of that. Maybe we need to start younger. And we still try to watch the news at night with our kids, and they're 4.5-year-old. And my daughter said to me the other day, why do you always want to watch the news? And we said, to be smart.
But,
we just said to be smart because that was the fastest thing. But now, unfortunately, we find ourselves having to, some of the national news stories, bleeds, it leads. And I have to, click away because I don't want to explain that at that age.
Here's the biggest question of the night. Do any of you know anyone going to school right now for journalism?
I have an intern that's coming in.
No.
I have an intern that's coming in at the end of August.
Okay, you have an intern, but do you know anybody personally? A family, friend, relative? I mean, when I went to journalism school, we knew at least some people that wanted to be a journalist for a living. I mean, who wants to be a journalist anymore? So you can basically walk in. It's like, I don't even know what to compare it to at this point. Like when I was a kid, and I don't know when you went to school, like what job was basically phasing itself out at that point? Because that's basically what, going to school for journalism is. You're basically setting yourself up for a lifetime of misery, low pay, and no jobs, right? So, I mean, that's the biggest next chapter. Like, who's going to report this stuff? Like, people like me with 30 years experience are getting fired from the Press of Atlantic City. How is a kid going to make it in this business? That's just fresh out of school, and after they want to make more than $20,000 a year, like it's an impossibility.
I agree with you, and I can tell you, somebody I've spent the last couple of weeks interviewing candidates for an open reporter position. We moved Joey Fox to Washington recently to step up and cover the delegation. Joey has been great, and he didn't graduate with a degree in journalism. And none of the people that I've really been interviewed or been interviewing are people that pursued decided to pursue a career in journalism. They did other things. Some of them work for the school papers, but they're not journalism majors. And that's how it used to be. There was a natural progression. You'd study journalism, you'd get that degree, and you'd go work for newspapers, and you'd work your way up. You'd be, you'd be 22 and covering a zoning board meeting, and you'd wind up moving on up to county and the state house and courts. But now it's just not that case, and it's just not the way it works. And
well, it's like Deborah said, is there an appetite for state house coverage? Like, to get the state house job was like what every journalist wanted in the newsroom, right? Like, if you got to travel up to Trenton, and like, man, that's awesome, right? Like, that's what you aspire to do as a journalist. So, I do think people still want that coverage, but there's no state house reporters anymore. I mean, the entire state of New Jersey has one Associated Press reporter. Think about that. Like, when we started, there had to be dozens of them, right? I mean, when I started, I should say, I'm an old man, but my point is, sorry about that. But my point is, it's over. The idea of that kind of coverage and that kind of journalism, it's over. And then you have, Michael will tell you, in our area, all of these people who want to be media personalities, but have no journalistic standards or ethics. They just want to be on Facebook or Instagram and take pictures and go to events and say that they're media, right? But they're not media. They're posers,
influencers.
Right?
They want to be an influencer.
Well, I think one of the I think one of the issues that it just, and then I want to, we're going to go a little over time, so I apologize to our panelists. But I think one of the things, and it's really tough, what is news and what isn't news. I've noticed that the Newsbreak app is sometimes not the best aggregator of actual news, because they'll pick up things and realize, no, it's actually commentary you're picking up from somebody, but they pick it up as if it's news. So I think they have to do a better job of that. But I think as we're wrapping up here, and I appreciate everybody going a few minutes overtime for us, is there one small thing, because I think the goal is have a couple more of these, have a report to give to policymakers and media folks, say, hey, here's some ideas how we can end this food desert, or news desert. We also have a food desert in South Jersey. That's for another round table. This news desert in southern New Jersey. I mean, is there one small thing that either we as the public, the media organizations, lawmakers can do to help with it? I would say my suggestion, one small thing, is a vigorous marketing campaign, even if it's just viral, organic social media, to encourage folks to support their local mom and pop, so to speak, news organizations, whether it's a TAPinto, whether it's Front Runner New Jersey, whether it's WOND, whether it's used to be Route 40, Breaking AC. Is there one thing that you would recommend be done to help further the goal along of ending the news desert here in southern New Jersey? Nobody will volunteer once.
Well,
It's the easiest question.
I'll give you one, which is people who put their stories behind paywalls, where your access to news is based upon what you can afford to spend, and something elected officials can do if they wanted to, and they wanted to step up and maybe help that out, is if they're going to give an exclusive to a daily newspaper, negotiate up front. I'll give you the story, but I want it free for everybody. Not, I'm going to use, I'm going to take my, I'm a government official and I'm going to give you an exclusive, and it's okay for you to monetize it. Give it free. I mean, tell them up front, just make it free. One example I saw is, and I don't want to keep picking on the Star Ledger. Well, maybe I do, maybe just a little, but during the last legislative session, they had a debate over Stay NJ, which was the proposal to reduce local property tax bills for seniors. And Tom Moran, the editorial page editor, decided to write some scathing editorials and columns about this. Now, I'm, Scott said he's old. I'm probably a lot older than him. My first job in the legislature was 1973, so it goes way, way back. But there was a time, and I would argue it wasn't even that long ago, where if the Star Ledger put its full weight against an issue, setting out to kill it, you'd have legislators, Liz, you know this, you work there. You would have legislators hiding under their desks. Their sphincters would be tightening. They'd be losing control of bodily functions. And there was no way that they would vote for the bill. Now it gets posted anyway, and not a single vote was influenced by the editorial board of the state's largest newspaper, which ought to say something. But the other side of it was this. So Moran writes this column, and whether he was right or wrong, that's not for me to say, but he writes this column that says that this proposal is screwing over poor people, that the state's poorest residents are going to be hurt by this. And then the Star Ledger goes and they put this column behind a paywall. So the very same people that Moran said were being screwed over by the bill were getting screwed over by the Star Ledger. Their readers couldn't even afford to know that they were being taken advantage of. They had no way of developing an opinion. So it's probably a longer answer than you wanted, but yeah, I think maybe those who are being covered should stand up in defense of their constituency and say, sure, I'll talk to you. Sure, I'll give you stories. Sure, I'll cooperate, but put my story in front of a paywall. Don't allow the information that I give you to be read only by those who can afford to read it.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that's a great point. And then, there's a kind of a national movement, and they have some interesting ideas. I'm not taking sides either way, but some of the ideas that they've been espousing, it's Stephen Waldman, who founded Report for America. He's leading this organization, and they have a couple of ideas to help encourage the local news and getting rid of news deserts. And so some of them are one, providing a tax credit for businesses to advertise in newspapers, whether it's online or in print, which is kind of interesting. Another idea is to have, like they did in New York City and some other places, where the government has to allocate a portion of their advertising to advertising in print and online newspapers, which is also kind of an interesting one. And then there's another idea which they're not talking about, and it has nothing to do with resources, but more so kind of fairness. There's a lot of municipalities now in New Jersey where they have their own Facebook page and their other social media channels. And what they're doing is they're putting out like their news, their press releases there before sending them to any of the media outlets, so that they basically can kind of dictate the message. And by the time they send it to the media outlets, for us to actually do real news stories about them, their view or their position on the issue or on the particular release or whatever has, kind of saturated 20-30% of the town. Mm-hmm. And I think that and it's difficult because that's a matter of freedom of speech and things like that. But to me, there's something that should be done about that, where, for government, if they're going to release something on social media, they have to release it to the media at the same time. They shouldn't be able to get a day, even a few hours start on the media by putting it out on their social media channel and kind of dictating what the message is going to be, and then forcing the local news media or whatever to try to, find that press release on their social media channel to then do some original reporting on it.
So a couple things. One that I think that would help is what I said earlier. Maybe make it easier for commercial news organizations to convert into nonprofits. That might be a way for the government to help, along with maybe giving tax credits to newspapers, things like that, to operate. And also, like I said, Lee Enterprises was the devil to me, as are a lot of these. Maybe recognize that when these mergers happen, that they are troublesome and they reduce the amount of local reporting. They reduce the amount of people who are working for these organizations. So maybe try to see if that violates federal antitrust law, just like you would watch mergers of other corporations. Maybe these big newspaper conglomerations are bad for newspapers all around the country, as well as for society. And then finally, my other problem, who's going to be a journalist? Well, maybe try to classify journalism as a public service profession, so that you can make eligible, you can have loan forgiveness, just like you do for some other occupations, like say teachers or nurses or things like that. So those are just some things that I think could help help.
Those are great ideas.
Liz Meyers, I'll give you the last
one. I think they're all really interesting ideas, and maybe our tap into brain is a little working, but like Mike was saying, is I think we need to. It starts at local elected officials and explaining to them, like, if they don't have a public information officer in their town, to talk to your local news, support our endeavors to be that voice. We're not the enemy. We could be a partner with you. We are going to check you, and we are going to ask for somebody, that might be a counterpoint. But come to us before you go to Facebook, right? Because we can put a lot more meat on that bone, and we have a universe of readers who aren't on social media. There's a lot of people who have turned it off, right? So we can access through direct channels through our readers, and then we do have the social media component. So I think it's important, the towns we work best with and we have the easiest time doing local news are the towns who have public information officers in their municipal building, who have communications people in their school district. And not just people that are putting out videos and things like that, but people who can write. I mean, we all as a society, I think, forgot how to write. I remember years ago. And spell, right? I mean, look, I don't text the way I speak because you're texting. And I remember years ago, somebody told me that would been a reading teacher for years. And she'd said to me, texting is going to be the end of the English language. Ooh. Right? Maybe. And so now we have to teach kids coming up early how to get back to writing and punctuation and sourcing and attributing quotes. So you understand what's true. But I think we really need to impress upon on the local level, because we all know, those of us in politics, local officials become state officials, and some go to Congress and some don't. It all has to start somewhere. And that has to start, at home, of people working with you and, not always viewing us as the enemy, but somebody who is a partner in getting the accurate information out there. And right now, where there are places that there is no information, there's also no accurate information. So, this has, I think, been a really exciting time, and appreciate the thought, Mike, to bring us all together.
No, listen, I think I really appreciate everybody jumping on. This is a great conversation, the first of many. I think this is going to be a more substantive approach. Particularly, we need to look at local news coverage in historically disadvantaged communities like Camden, like Atlantic City, like Vineland, Millville. That's to be continued on an upcoming live stream. I think this is a great conversation. In some respects, I'm optimistic. In some respects, I'm pessimistic. So hopefully the optimism will outweigh the pessimism. If you like this chat, please follow us on all social media. Go to southjerseyforward.org. Please stay tuned for our next virtual roundtable this Wednesday, 6 p.m. We have a live stream about the role of the Department of Community Affairs in the city of Atlantic City. We'll be joined by Jacqueline Suarez, who's the director of the Division of Local Government Services, as well as former State Senator Chris Brown, who is the special advisor for Atlantic City Affairs. And learning more, you hear takeover, you hear intervention. What exactly is the role of DCA in Atlantic City? And let's dive into the policy of that and how that's changed over the years. So really appreciate that on Wednesday, 6 p.m., where you're watching this right now. And again, Mike Shapiro, David Wildstein, Scott Cronick, Liz Meyers, thank you so much for your time. This was a really great conversation. And folks, we'll see you at the next one. Thank you so much. SouthJerseyForward.org.
Thanks, Michael.